The usual disclaimer applies to the paper that due to my affiliation with the Central Bank of Norway, that whatever I say does not represent anything they think about this subject or economics or anything at all in general. Okay, so this paper is about understanding why people are staying in places that are in economic decline, which is the kind of bit vague what that is, but it's really thinking about like you have prospects of locations. Some places are growing, some are not growing, or even stagnant or shrinking in terms of by some economic measure. And this is something we've been thinking about as economists for decades. Standard literature has studied the role of housing in understanding this. And within this literature, I am specifically thinking about the role of being a homeowner versus a renter, and what is the role of shocks to housing wealth or that follow changes in local economic conditions. So how can these factors explain slow migration? And why people haven't studied this in detail before is, I think, due to the lack of data. Like, not many data sets in not many data sets that is this can you sort of renters versus homeowners and how much housing wealth people have. But also, even if you had this, that's not the only thing that is different across workers or how homeowners versus renters. There are other variables that determine these, like the choice of being a homeowner, for example, age or income, and all these other characteristics go into the decision how you respond in terms of migration when economic conditions change. So we need to be able to address this. We need to observe workers over time, how they move around, what their housing characteristics are, but also all these other variables that are relevant for this. We also need this in a setting where we have some shock that we can observe to the economic conditions that is big enough to start changing home prices so we can actually have a housing wealth shock. So I go about this trying to address these challenges using administrative data from Norway. So there's very rich data in Norway, can follow workers over time. I'm going to focus on the 2010s and the episode around the oil price plunge of 2014 to 2016, and focus then on the region of Stavanger, which is the center for the oil industry in Norway. And the analysis consists of two parts. So we'll have an empirical analysis where I study how, at the worker level, migration behavior changes. And I'll take these findings and try to explain them using a life cycle model with location decisions that I calibrate to my microdata. And what I want you to take away from this paper is really summarized in this slide. So I do document, as people have done before, that there is a small rise in outmigration following a shock to local economic conditions. But this dimension I can focus on now, due to the richness of the data of homeowners versus renters, shows that there's very big heterogeneity in this response. So renters and homeowners who have little housing wealth, they actually are increasing their leaving rates, while homeowners who have more housing wealth reduce their leaving rate. So on net, if we average across these groups, we get this small rise in the outmigration. But just looking at that number kind of hides that there are some that are responding a lot by actually leaving the area. So instead of being a story which has been proposed before, that renters face these, actually might appreciate reductions in housing costs, and that's why people are not leaving places that are in economic decline. I say it's really about homeowners with more housing wealth that are reducing their leaving rates, and that is what's depressing the outmigration response in aggregates. And the model helps us understand this. And the mechanism that underlies this I refer to as the housing wealth effect. And what that does is that when we have falling home prices, we get a reduction in the wealth of homeowners, And that reduces the value of other locations compared to before. Because if you're going to sell your house, you're going to be able to afford less consumption and less housing in that whatever destination you move to. And that is what's reducing their leaving rate or their leaving response. So I want to make a lot of contributions to the literature, of course, but the overarching, I also just to because of the I had to be a bit brief. The overarching contribution is that I can both empirically and structurally contrast between homeowners versus renters and homeowners of different housing wealth in these both empirically and structurally to carefully think about the different economic forces that are affecting them and their incentives to move or not. And so I can really focus on this housing wealth effect that underlies models thinking about these things that haven't been studied in as much detail before, I argue. So the outline of the paper is I'm going to tell you about what happened to Stavanger. Then we're going to look at some aggregate statistics for that. Then we're going to go into the heterogeneity and using the microdata, and then take our findings and study them through the lens of a life cycle model. So Stavanger is a city or a municipality on the southwest coast of Norway, where as I said, where the oil industry is concentrated. I'm going to look at the whole commuting zone or labor market area surrounding Stavanger. So that makes up about 351,000 people in 2013. And of working age population, 14% are directly employed by the oil sector. If we look at this the episode leading up to the oil price plunge. So what happened was that following June 2014, oil prices started to drop dramatically. Over an 18-month period, prices fell by 66%, and mostly this was due to the rise in US fracking. So I interpret this as and technological innovation led to more use of fracking in the US. Due to technological innovation, that's a persistent change. And from the perspective of Norway, it's as it was a rise in international competition, which is often what has been studied in this literature, and people have been thinking about how does workers respond to rising international competition. Okay, I'll just have a quick look at what happened to oil prices. Just to illustrate this, I need to move this bar also. Okay, so here we have kind of the pre-shock price level, both of spot prices and futures prices. So this is futures for oil futures, looking at oil being delivered in June 2023. And then we have June 2014 here. We see this big drop, and it's, as you see, persistent. It's only when Russia invades Ukraine, or also during the pandemic, we start to see big rises in oil. We also had like big drops in oil. But this is kind of the one equilibrium we're moving from to another. This led to big cuts in investment in the oil sector in Norway and big layoffs. Here in this figure, I'm looking at people who were not laid off. But still, we see here that the prospects of Stavanger versus the rest of the country changed dramatically across this period. So I'm going to explain the figure now. So what I've estimated here is the difference in earnings between workers in Stavanger versus the rest of the country year by year, and using 2013 as a benchmark. So what we see to the left is that earnings are growing above trend or above the overall Norwegian trend leading up to 2014. Then we have this big reversal following 2014. So the point of this is to show that, okay, before Stavanger was a place where people wanted to move to because earnings were higher, then we had this big reversal suddenly incomes are falling relative to the national average, not just for people in oil that are in red, but also for people who are not in oil, especially the local service sector that saw big reductions in earnings relative to the rest of the country. But we do not see a big outflow from Stavanger in the post period. So here I plotted the change, the relative change in the migration flows. So I estimate the leaving probability and then plot by how many percent that increases or decreases following 2013. In 2015, we see a rise in the leaving probability from Stavanger, but that is reversed, and we even get a reduction in 2018 relative to 2013. However, the arrival probability drops by 29% on average, indicating that people are internalizing that the prospects of Stavanger have changed a lot. That's why people are not moving there anymore. But people just keep moving out at the same rate as they did before the shock. We don't see a big increase in the leaving rate. I also want to illustrate what happened to home prices, since housing wealth shocks is an important part of my analysis. So that does respond quite a lot. The data availability is not that good for cities or municipalities in Norway for different reasons. So I proxied Stavanger by the county called Rogaland. So that's like Rogaland, 80% of Rogaland is Stavanger labor market area. So it's a pretty good proxy. That's the only county that experienced a drop in home prices following 2014. And you see it's pretty persistent all the way into 2019. While all other counties grow, I exclude Oslo County, the capital of Norway, from this graph because that just dwarfs all the changes in all these counties, but also it's just taking off tremendously in the post period here. For rents, there's even less data, but luckily Stavanger is one of the cities that is represented in this data set of rents, and also the most typical destinations for Stavanger workers to move to. So we see also here that Stavanger is the only city that experienced a drop in rents following 2014, while all the other cities where people would probably move to see big rises in rents. And the relative difference between these two, or the gap in housing costs that emerges, is about 23-24% over the period. It's pretty significant. So now I documented some aggregate statistics. Now we're going to go into the micro data to understand if there's any heterogeneity in this response. So I put together a panel of workers in Norway at an annual frequency. I exclude oil workers for this analysis, but it's pretty robust to include the oil workers into the analysis as well. Focus on working age people. When I construct this panel, I have a panel about 200,000 people that I ever observed living in Stavanger, and the whole overall population will be 2.5 million in Norway. And for every worker here, I observe all their moves that they register with the tax authorities in Norway, which is a pretty accurate measure due to different benefits you get. It's very important that you register when you move in Norway. I can match all that data with different labor market variables, such as who your employer is, what sector you're working. I have different measures of income, such as labor earnings, business earnings, capital earnings, but also government benefits, such as unemployment compensation. There's also wealth tax in Norway and a wealth registry that can be matched with all of this. So there I can see what the value is of their primary residence, where the household lives. I see other real estate investments, but then also a lot of financial variables such as bank deposits, stocks, mutual funds, but also debt. I have some demographics. in the current version of the paper, I only look at age, but I've looked at other dimensions as well. Yeah, there's a lot of data there. And lastly, something that turns out to be very important actually when thinking about migration in normal times is, where do your relatives live compared to you? So I have, for every worker, I see their partner or the ID of their partner and their parents. So I can then understand, or I can compute where your siblings live relative to you and where your children live relative to you, and how everyone's moving around each other. And then I take this panel to estimate a logit model. So now the goal is to show how different groups respond differently to the shock to Stavanger. So I'm going to take my Stavanger sample, and I have a dummy that is, are you leaving Stavanger this year or not? It's 1 or 0. Use a logit specification to get this the left-hand side here. And for now, I'm doing a very simple difference in difference regression. We're going to include more controls later. I'm going to pick some variable, some demographic or some characteristic, and assign workers to bin based on that. So you can think of, for example, I can bin people by age. So I'm going to have computed quintiles of ages in Norway. I'm going to assign a worker in Stavanger to, if they're in the youngest bin quintile, second youngest, mid, second highest, or highest. And I'm going to regress, use my logit model on this dummy. And so then this coefficient gamma b will be reflecting the average leaving odds for that particular bin in the pre-period. And then I include in this regression the same dummy interacted with a post dummy, which is following 2014. And here that coefficient, beta b, will be reflecting the change in the average leaving odds for that particular bin. And then I will plot these coefficients in this fashion. So here I bin people by, first of all, are you a renter versus a homeowner? And then within homeowner, I assign it to different housing wealth bins, also computed using quintiles. What we see here are positive coefficients to the left. And to the right, we have negative coefficients. So the positive ones indicate we have an increase in the leaving odds for these bins and reductions in the leaving probabilities to the right. So renters and homeowners with the least housing wealth are actually leaving more in the post period than they were before, and the opposite for the higher housing wealth groups. So now I'm going to group them into low housing wealth, which are renters plus homeowners with housing wealth below the first quintile, and then we're going to refer to the rest of the other homeowners as high housing wealth homeowners. As I said, this is a very simplistic regression. It is just looking at one dimension of the data. There are a lot of things that are different between someone who chooses to be a renter versus a homeowner. One example is the age. Renters are typically much younger than homeowners with more housing wealth, but also homeowners with little housing wealth are on average much younger than people with more housing wealth. And that could be why these groups are responding differently to the shock to Stavanger. And that appears to be the case if we just, instead of binning by housing wealth, we're going to bin them by their age. We see here that the youngest group in this graph are actually increasing their leaving rate, while all other groups are reducing their leaving rates. But if I take each one of these bins and split them up by high versus low housing wealth, this pattern to the right emerges, which is consistent across different figures that I study, which is that low housing wealth people, whatever their bin, they increase their leaving probability, while those with high either have the same leaving probability as before, or you get significant reductions. So from this, I interpret that it's not that younger people are leaving more because they're younger, as we see here. It's because they're to a higher or are on average more likely to be low housing wealth people. But there are even more characteristics that differ across renters versus homeowners and different housing wealths. For example, people who choose to invest their wealth into a location are more likely to also have relatives in the location. People who are renters or low housing wealth are more likely to become unemployed. They're also more likely to be low net worth and more likely to be low income. And all these things are natural to think about as like how people, like something that people are considering when they're thinking, should I move from Stavanger or not now that incomes are falling relative to the rest of the country? So I produce all these figures where I try to contrast these against each other. But the same pattern emerges that low housing wealth respond significantly more than high housing wealth. But I think the most convincing way to actually show this is just throw everything into the sink at one time in one or in a couple of regressions so I can add them jointly, which is what I do in this exercise. So now I'm going to contrast low versus high instead of the different bins, but then add in different covariates, such as young and post times young. Having relatives in Stavanger plus post times having relatives in Stavanger, and so on. And if I start out with no of these other interactions, only with the first line here, we have a difference of 0.29 in terms of log changes. But as I keep on adding these other interactions, we do not get a reduction in the effect. It's like, well, only 0.28 for one of these interactions. In all other cases, we get increases in the difference between low housing wealth versus high housing wealth. And if it was the case that any of these variables would be what's actually explaining the difference, we would get a reduction in this estimate. So that is the empirical exercise I performed. Now let's try to set up the life cycle model to understand from a structural perspective what is actually explaining this. So why is it that we observe this difference in the migration response following the income shock?
Jesper?
Yeah, which is, yeah.
A quick question.
Yeah.
Could it be that when income drops in Stavanger, maybe also access to housing credit decreases,
Okay.
which might end up increasing the rental price? And by doing so, homeowners, they have a higher utility of reducing their mobility, their migration incentive, because now that it's more difficult for usual renters to have access to buy a home, rental price increasing, they have, well, the point is that is it not maybe a room for such a mechanism to be at play also?
Okay, so sorry, you said that. Can you repeat that, please?
Okay, what I mean is, in response of the shock,
yeah,
wages decreases.
Mm.
The decrease in wage lead to, let's say, bankers, they are less prone to give credit.
Yeah.
To buy homes or housing. And because of that, there is like a kind of a pressure on the demand. This pressure on the demand for housing services leads to an increase in rental prices.
Increase in rental prices. Okay, all else equal. Okay.
Yeah. And this is, let's say, a homeowner being a utility maximizer might have less interest
Mm.
to move.
To move because of this, because there's a reduction in their right. Yeah, but that would also, if they wanted to move, they could just sell their houses at a lower price, right? I mean, you can always lower the price to get rid of your house if you really want to move. So there's always this trade-off in the end. And I agree with that channel that you suggested could explain why prices are falling. But if they really wanted to move, they could sell still. But you mean okay, maybe I should think a bit more about this with respect to renters. So people have made, so just to be clear, like people have made the case that renters should be staying more because rents are falling more and home prices are falling more. So if the renter wanted to become a homeowner, they could actually find housing cheaper now, which would also reduce their leaving motive.
Cheaper, but they do not have access to credit anymore.
Oh, yeah, I was making okay, so I would have, I have not, yes. Let's see, I do not, I could look into the response of the financial markets. See if I've been reading reports like from Central Bank of Norway and other government institutions. I have not seen discussions about big response from the financial sector or them starting to reevaluating. I should be careful thinking about that. Okay, thanks for that input.
Jesper,
yeah.
Did you also control for children and marital status?
Yeah, so I've done that. Yeah. I don't remember if it's in the current version. I have, for example, split up people by household size. So you have household 1, household 2, and then 3, and then greater. And we see the same kind of persistent difference across different housing wealth. So that's why it's not controlling for it, but it is pretty much doing the same thing, just a different way.
Because it's likely very correlated also with like house ownership. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so one other benefit of having a model is that we can see how we can try to think about how the general equilibrium effect through home prices either amplifies or ameliorates or compensates the consequences from the income shock. And that will be very useful to understand actually what the forces that renters versus homeowners are facing. So I set up a discrete time life cycle model where we have heterogeneous locations that I'm going to describe in a couple of slides, how they differ from each other. I'm also going to have workers who are heterogeneous. So they will be different from each other because they have different skills. They will have different preferences for location. So some people will have a strong preference for the current location. Some other workers will have a strong preference for some other location. Everyone has one favorite location. People will be of different age, they will have different assets, and they will have different house size, which will determine if they're a renter versus a homeowner. So given your skills, preferences, age, origin, as in where do you wake up this period, how much assets you bring into that period, and your current home size, the worker will be choosing where they're going to move to, how much non-durable consumption they're going to consume in that location, how big of a house you're going to live in that location, and how much savings to bring into the next period. We have Kapdag's utility function here. And to that, we will add this constant additional utility if you live in your preferred location. There will be some amenity in every location that is free, like it could be quality of nature, or other things that you are not paying for. Unless you're kind of paying it for it through home prices, but you're not paying for it using non-durable consumption. But then if you choose to move, that will incur some moving cost tau. So people do not like to move in general. There will also be financial costs. Those enter into the budget constraints. But to then generate moves, especially suboptimal moves from an economic perspective, we will have preference shocks that hit everyone every day. So every worker will wake up and have this additional Xi-D utility for every possible location. So for example, I would wake up, I live in Los Angeles, but now suddenly I have a big preference shock that makes me want to live in Finland. So then, because if I want to enjoy that additional utility for this one period, I need to move to Finland to enjoy Xi Finland. We're going to calibrate how big these moving costs are in terms of this utility and how wide this distribution is to try to match data of migrations we all actually observe. Agents are forward-looking. There's law of motion for savings. And if you are a homeowner, you also get access to mortgages. You can borrow using a mortgage. If you're a renter, you cannot borrow. And this is something I've done for now. I'm really thinking about changing this, but the benefit of being a homeowner is that you can access bigger housing units. Okay, so if you choose to live in a unit smaller than H bar R, you are a renter. If you choose a housing unit that is bigger, you're going to be a homeowner, and that's when you get access to the mortgage and have to actually pay the home price. Okay, locations differ by base wages. So even if you have these 0 skills, you can make different wages in different locations, but then we have different returns to skill across locations. As I mentioned, we have amenities that differ across locations and home prices that differ across locations and are determined in equilibrium. There's a fixed supply of housing. I think it's an innocuous assumption for the kind of experiment that we're going to run. And there's this landlord who lives abroad. They're just maintaining units. So whatever value is created from that is extracted from the economy. They also they buy and they sell housing units and they rent out housing units. And I do not model the firm side of the economy. Instead, I have this exogenous income process where income is determined by your age. There's some life cycle profile. It looks the same across locations, but then we had the base wage entering here, and then your skills times the skill premium determines how much you will make in a specific location. And what I'm going to do in the experiment, or to mimic the Stavanger experiment, is going to feed in a reduction in the base wage of Stavanger and hold all the other base wages fixed. So it's going to be a reduction of 6%. So this corresponds to the long-term change in relative earnings across locations from one of the previous graphs, like in the earlier parts of the paper. And in a second experiment, I'll also let home prices respond to the income shock. So in the case of only incomes fall, the leaving rate increases by 29% in the model. So if we compare that to the data, that was a rise at 0.37%. So we get a much bigger response if only incomes fall. Arrival rate falls by 72%. That's a pretty dramatic response, while it was only 29% reduction in the data. Now, if I let home prices fall, we get a reduction of 14% compared to 23% in the data. The leaving rate gets much more muted. We have a rise of 2.6% compared to 0.37% before, or 0.37 in the data. The arrival rate is also, or the change in it is more muted, albeit still pretty big, minus 31%, but that is comparable to what we observe in the data, 29% reduction.
Yes, but you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So aggregates kind of match. We also match pretty well when it comes to the heterogeneity in the response. So if I bin people by low, mid, and high housing wealth, we see the same monotonic behavior that people with low are increasing their leaving probability, while the high housing wealth people reduce their leaving probability. That's pretty important that we are able to recreate that behavior. And now we can say why. So why is this? And so just to simplify the discussion, I'm going to group people like homeowners versus renters instead. I'm going to talk now in terms of changes of welfare in the origin that is affected versus the destination, some potential destination that is unaffected. So when we have a reduction in incomes, that makes origin less attractive for everyone. That would make everyone more likely to leave. But if you only have a falling housing costs, that will affect people differently. So for renters, that makes the origin more attractive actually, because it's cheaper to stay, we're less likely to leave. So this should be offsetting. And we see that here, if I compute the change in welfare, if only home prices respond, we get an increase in welfare from staying for renters. But if we have the combined shock, we get on net a reduction in welfare for renters. Homeowners that experience a reduction in housing costs also experience a reduction in welfare. So that would make their current location less attractive, all else equal. So if they could just move to a destination and not suffer from this, they would actually be more inclined to do so, especially if we put on, like, to slam on the income shock, which shows that homeowners are a lot worse off compared to renters because renters are being compensated by reduction in rents, while homeowners suffer more due to the reduction of housing wealth. But what's important is to note that also the value of moving is changing, because when housing costs fall, you bring less wealth with you to your destination. And even if, no matter if incomes fall in your origin, destinations are all else equal less attractive than they were before. While for renters, the value of moving hasn't really changed, or the value of a destination hasn't changed at all. But what matters for migration is the change, or what matters for the change in migration will be the change in the difference of the values across locations. So if we take the difference between these changes, even though homeowners are suffering if they stay, and much more so than the renter, because they also suffer when they move, the net change is not as big as it is for renters, which is why renters are responding more than homeowners. And that is kind of the takeaway of this paper, that we really need to think carefully about how housing wealth affects the value of moving versus staying. And we need to consider is, if we want to understand why people might not respond so much when economic conditions suddenly change. We enter in some kind of economic decline. And this can help us understand why that is low aggregate response, but rich heterogeneity in that migration response. We can show this both in data and in a model, so they are consistent with each other. I also have additional results that you can see in the papers. I performed some policy analysis, so like what is how effective are moving vouchers in stimulating migration, but also I can explain in using the model the heterogeneity in the in-migration response, or the changes in migration, which is also very heterogeneous and very interesting, but just too little time to go through all of that. Okay, that's the paper. Please read it in detail if you find this interesting, and thanks for your questions and comments.
A quick question, Jesper.
No, I would like to postpone that after the discussion, Narcisse.
Okay.
Sorry for that. But yeah, let's give the floor first to Luis, and then we open the floor for everyone.
Hopefully, you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Felix. Okay, thank
All
you
good.
very much. Okay, so again, thank you very much for the invitation to discuss and the incentive to go through Jesper's like really cool paper. You've all seen it. I'll just like restate the question briefly, at least as I see it. And this paper is about how or why workers don't move away as much as you might expect after a regional negative shock. And specifically, it explores the potential role of home ownership in that effect. It's kind of a classic question, great empirical strategy with like very fine data. As you saw, the model is like very interesting and kind of with, you know, sophisticated and correct ingredients to explore this question. And it's a cool paper in that it's the combination of both the empirical side and the model that kind of allows Jesper to try to bring to the literature this new housing wealth channel that hadn't really been shown talked about before. You know, it's a cool kind of almost as Jesper mentioned, classic question that many people have looked at. It touches like on different literatures from urban to labor to household finance, of course. I do think that the paper, at least so far, would benefit, and it would like make it more easily and immediately attractive to a wider audience. It kind of, if kind of the question and the introduction, let's say, were already sharper and hinting directly at the concrete mechanism that Jesper is highlighting, because you know, as it stands, it could mean a lot of different mechanisms. It could be about moving costs. It could be about search in the labor market. It could be about mortgages. It could be about search in the housing market. There's, especially on the last part and the more like finance side, there is a large literature looking at this question in the past 10, 15 years. And so I think it would benefit the paper to immediately come be clear about I'm bringing something else to the table that's not really about these financial constraints. What's that mechanism? My interpretation or my take on what's the like critical thing that Jesper is bringing to the table is this idea of or incentive to defer realization of capital losses in housing. This idea that until I sell my house, considering the prices went down, I'm relatively richer. It's not to me super like clear from as a reader, let's say, why, and maybe it could be like clarified why this is how this relates to migration, in the sense that, at least stated like this, it seems like it's a disincentive to moving for homeowners in general and not specific about leaving. Of course, leaving like and moving out will be one consequence of that, and you can think that it might be stronger for someone who potentially wants to move, in the sense that prices went down in my city, in Stavanger in this case. If I move outside, I'm going to face both this income effect and a substitution effect, because housing abroad became relatively more expensive. Whereas if I move next door, I just have the income effect. So of course it might be stronger for migration, but still it's a point that kind of affects homeowners in general without migration as one consequence. I think it would be cool to just like highlight that from the beginning. I'm not going to go through all my slides. Don't worry. In my time, I'll just spend a bit of time like bringing some thoughts on the mechanism first, and then a couple of issues on the data, which hopefully we can discuss later. So there's this sentence I'm highlighting from the paper here in the discussion of like the main results, where Jesper writes at one point, homeowners who wish to move would make less after the shock from selling their current dwelling and now are unable to afford housing of the same quality in other locations. And this acts as a pull factor on the homeowner to stay. Now, one point is that this kind of relative price part of the effect or substitution part of the effect would also be true for renters. So this is like one aspect of my comment, let's say. But the second one, and perhaps more relevant, is that as for the income effect of homeowners, which is I think what Jesper is shedding light on, it's not immediately obvious whether this is a disincentive to move in itself, or just a result of moving decisions, because the answer to that will depend on why house prices are dropping in the first place and what's going on in the housing markets of Stavanger in this case. So what I mean is that, if we think about it for a second, why are prices going down? And this, is not super like explicitly defined in the paper, perhaps because it's kind of obvious considering the broader like discussion and what we're doing here. But maybe I think it would be helpful to spell that out clearly, even if it's obvious that what's, the hypothesis here is that there's this shift in labor demand in Stavanger because of this technological shock in this case. This will lead to less jobs and lower wages in equilibrium, which then lead to a shift in housing demand in the local housing market. So in a nutshell, house prices are falling because the incentives to live and work in Stavanger are lower. This is kind of maybe obvious, but it would be helpful to spell it out clearly that this is what's going on, because the implications will then come from there, in the sense that this effect kind of applies to homeowners who work in Stavanger as well. And because for prices to go down, someone has to sell the houses, right? Now, if the housing market in Stavanger were composed only of workers who own their house, then it's not really clear that this pull factor is not the same thing as a push factor, in the sense that the new price equilibrium would basically depend on homeowners themselves selling the house. And actually, the general equilibrium effect in that sense will be that prices would kind of fall less to offset some of the change in wages, like in the wage differential between the two locations. And so my thought, but I mean, correct me if like you think of it differently, is that there's kind of something missing in this argument for it to kind of to round off what's this income effect for homeowners. And it's probably just it's about this interaction between a rental market and an owner occupier market that's separate. Because then it becomes kind of clear that if owner occupier houses are one thing and house for rental is another thing, and those rental houses are owned by some foreign or retired, for example, landlords, when renters leave, this depresses house prices in Stavanger in this case. And from the point of view of a homeowner, this depreciation is kind of exogenous. It doesn't depend on my own decisions of selling or buying. And that's when this income effect might emerge, where I can avoid capitalizing these losses that come from this other source of demand in the housing market. And this will let me, and this generates the effect that I think Jesper is talking about. Still, it's kind of not very obvious, at least to me at first hand, how or why that effect would change with the value of the home, which is kind of important here for the empirical results. But I mean, in any case, even if it's not super clear at the moment, the good news is that the model is like ready to show this, because you already have the ingredients necessary for this. It's just about finding like the right counterfactual to look at this, like different roles of the rental market with housing stock that's owned by someone else, and the owner-occupier / worker market. Let me skip this other point. I have 2 minutes, one for each of these other comments. One point is about the housing wealth data. It's never like really clearly defined what housing wealth means. And in this data, I have a little bit of experience with it from another project. This is kind of important because the data is a little bit problematic with housing. I mean, in principle, when you say housing wealth, you mean just the measured value of the primary residence. This kind of is one of the variables you have. Obviously, one first point is that to interpret this, you really need mortgage debt as well. And this is kind of in another data set, if I understand correctly, that allows you to get it. The indebtedness like measures you get just from looking at the total debt data can be a little bit tricky, because in Norway, apparently there's a lot of student loans, and that kind of muddles a bit. When you look at debt, it's really a lot of that stuff is not mortgages. So you do need kind of some other source to separate that. But what I wanted to get at here is that there is like quite a bit of like evidence. There's this reference I'm putting here that says that the values of houses are pretty undervalued in this data. So these guys in this paper apply a certain correction to the data, I suppose, or maybe you can clarify if you use their correction or some like other more simple way to account for this. But in any case, even if you do, and there's still like some bias in the housing values left, the question is, could it be that this bias increases with the time since home purchase? Because if it does, then you would have that basically when you order people by housing wealth and in the bins that you sort in the paper, this could also be sorting actually by how old the house is or when the purchase took place. And this could probably like somehow favor also this decrease in propensity to move with wealth. This would mean that in practice, to some extent, some of that empirical result, is that people who have older house, who bought a house more recently are less likely to move, which would kind of be a slightly different story. I'm out of time, so I'll stop here. I have a bunch of other comments that I'll send you later. Just let me conclude in 2 seconds. I do think it's a really, really cool paper. It's pretty brave to bring this fresh look and a very new mechanism to a relatively crowded space. I do think that like making the mechanism a little bit more clear and maybe using your toy model could be helpful. In any case, you have a really cool model that provides a lab to flesh it out clearly and even perhaps later follow up with more research ideas. And yeah, good luck and happy to talk more later. Thank you.
Great. So unless you want to reply, I would suggest that we continue with more questions so you get more input. And you can do. Narcisse, you wanted to.
Yes, I was just wondering, Jesper, what would happen if you, okay, first of all, before saying what I'm about to say, the basic wage you referred to in the presentation, are you considering that basic wage as exogenous?
Sorry, what if I consider what being exogenous?
In your utility function, you referred to a base. If I'm remembering correctly, you referred to a basic wage, something like that.
There's a base wage across
a
the
base
table.
wage, yeah, a base wage.
Yeah.
Is this base wage exogenous?
Yes.
What would happen if you consider a setting in which, because I guess that if people are moving, the density of employment is also shifting in response to that. Yeah. And if firms are also profit maximizers, this would affect their hiring decisions also.
Yes.
And these have basically, there is an implied effect on the productivity and all those things. And this might end up kind of affecting not only the decision to move, because at the end of the day, the decision is to move is endogenous to income distribution across space, let's say. To what extent, or do you think that endogenizing wage formation would kind of change the predictions you made from your model?
It might, but I don't, as I think of this as affecting a small region of Norway and the rest of Norway being pretty unaffected. So that's why I think like it's fair to like say assume like there's a constant base wage across all the other locations, that they are not really responding because it's just such a small fraction that are actually moving. Of course, it could be the case that there's a lot of response, which is explaining why there is a big wage response that is enough to mute the migration response, like you're saying. Why I haven't done that is because just the model would not be, it's just so difficult to solve this structurally if you have all these forward-looking decisions and starting to consider also general equilibrium in wage formation. I think it is important to think about the how actually labor search works, and I think this would be an interesting setting to study that in. There is some work done using this, but I think there could be more done. I have not, but because of what I said, that I don't think I see that much response. And I think Stavanger is small enough to not be affecting, like it could affect small segments of the labor market. Like, for example, a lot of engineers were laid off. Where do they end up? So I have been considering looking at which sectors do people usually transition from when they go from being an oil engineer to some other engineering job. Yeah, I'm still on the fence if it's like a worthwhile endeavor to go down that avenue for this paper. I think that could be important to look at, and that could have some consequences, but it would be very difficult to incorporate into the model.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Probably not.
Yeah, well, then I could just address Louise. Like, I wanted to thank, it was really thoughtful comments, and yeah, if you could send your slides over, that would be, I mean, really great, so I could look more carefully at that. About the, I think I mean, with the data also, it is possible to look into some, like, for example, the undervaluation worry. My understanding is that for those years that I look at, they actually have fixed the valuation problem. But because I do observe every house transaction in Norway and I see the transaction price, I have not utilized that data, but I could use that to actually like go more into your concern. And I have been thinking that one exercise would be to bin people by time in current dwelling, like time since previous purchase, and see if we have the same pattern across variables, because that would address directly this concern, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, that would go completely over it. That would be
Oh.
like if you can have the time like since purchase, I think it's perfect. And also, I mean, obviously, especially thinking about this idea of like the separation between the rental markets and owner markets. If you with the transaction data, you can basically see who is selling like to leave or not, right? So
Yeah.
that would like give you yeah, like give you know, if you have that on the side of your empirical results, that would be like basically make it almost bulletproof, probably. So
Hopefully.
no, but that's if you have the
Great.
transaction data, that's cool. That's cool.
So I'd say we take the last question and then we can also close it. Do you want to speak up yourself? I gave you the,
Yeah,
or should
for
I
sure.
read it? Great, thanks.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you were accounting for maybe variation in interest rates from one year to the other. If the homeowner has a better mortgage than the current market, could that help to the likelihood of them moving or not?
Yeah, so it's not, I don't think it's driven by mortgage lock-in, because most rates are flexible in Norway. I have
Okay.
data on, I haven't done it yet, but like also that could also address some of Louis' comments, that I think I have a method of identifying mortgages in the data, because I see all loans issued.
Right.
So there is potential work to do there. I am not concerned due to like just being so flexible in general. It's just like
Got it.
the question will be if you're able to get a loan somewhere else. So like that's more about the financial market, but not the interest rate itself. But thanks for that.